everyone, it's Kelly here. Welcome to my channel if this is your first time. Welcome back if you've been before. Lovely to have you either way. On this channel we talk books, and today I am wrapping up my reading for the month of February. If you can hear a little bit of a weirdness in my voice, I mean, I don't know how closely anybody's paying attention. I can hear a difference in my voice. I've been unwell, so I am on the recovery now. I'm towards the end of my week of isolation from just having a respiratory viral thing. So not COVID, nothing too serious, but I do have a bit of a different voice today. But I'm not going to let that stop me from recording this video today, because I really just want to wrap up these books and let you know about them, because I'm keen to kind of then move on to my next month of reading. So let's talk about February and what I read that month. I read 6 books and I'm going to tell you about them. Some of them I have here to show you. 4 of them I have to show you, and the others I'll pop up on the screen so that you can see what they look like, because I don't have physical copies with me, and I'll let you know about that as I go along. Okay, the first book that I finished in the month of February was Stoneyard Devotional by Charlotte Wood. This is a recent release. It came out in 2023 and it was quite good. I have not read any Charlotte Wood before. This is my first Charlotte Wood, and I really enjoyed her voice in the way that she wrote. I enjoyed the sort of, I guess, calm quality that she had to the way she wrote this book and the characters and the setting. So essentially we have in this book a woman who is essentially retreating from life. So she has taken herself to stay in a monastery? No, what do you call it when it's women? A nunnery? A convent. Convent, that's the word I'm looking for. So she's taken herself to live in this convent, essentially, following some sort of events that are alluded to, but not really fully explained. We know that she's been married before. We know that she has children who are presumably adults, or at least teenagers, but we don't know that much else about her life prior to entering this convent. And during her stay, essentially this is a very reflective novel, so she's just reflecting on her life and the way she thinks, and the events that happen during her stay. So yeah, I really liked this. If you need there to be a lot of plot, this probably won't be for you. It's not a super plot heavy book. It's definitely more of a sort of reflective, deep dive on a character, I guess. Although you don't get much character change, it's more just her reflecting on things and sort of coming to terms with different things. But yeah, I really enjoyed that, because that's the kind of thing that I do actually quite like. So she sort of is working through her stuff, essentially. It's a steady, slow pace, and that pacing really seemed to mirror the setting, so mirror the life of being in a convent and sort of the daily, chores that you would have to do and so on. So yeah, I really liked it. I gave it 4 stars, and yeah, it was a great start to my reading this month. Okay, moving on to my second book that I finished in February, and that was this one, Audrey Magee's The Colony. This one I've been meaning to read for some time, and it's only just now that I've been able to pick it up. I've owned this copy now for a little bit. I remember exactly where I hauled this from, because I found it secondhand, and I was really excited about it because it was a book that I'd been waiting to read. This one unfortunately didn't quite live up to my expectations about it. So I enjoyed it, but it wasn't everything I was hoping it to be. So what drew me in terms of what I read in the blurb, is that we have a man who is an artist, and he goes to this remote island that's really inaccessible, really difficult to access. You have to go by boat. There's no flying over, and it's off the coast of Ireland. as in Ireland. The island, Island, is off the coast of Ireland, the country. So he's called Mr. Lloyd, and there is also another foreigner who comes to, so he's English, sorry, I should say. Then we also have this other foreigner who is a French man who comes, he's Mr. Masson, and he is a linguist, and he's studying the Irish language and sort of looking at kind of how it evolves over time. The reason that he's so excited to have found this island is because it is so remote, so people there, especially the older generations, only speak Irish. They do not speak English at all, and that he's sort of studying kind of over the generations the way that the language is being influenced by English. So he and Mr. Lloyd, Mr. Masson and Mr. Lloyd, are not pleased with the presence of each other, because Mr. Masson is not liking the fact that this Englishman has come to the island and is, sort of encouraging, because he doesn't speak any Irish, encouraging the people to speak English so that he can understand them. So Mr. Masson is not happy about that. And equally, Mr. Lloyd, who is a bit of a sort of gruff loner of a character, he just wants to paint, and he wants to be inspired by art and the landscape and the people, and to sort of not have Mr. Masson messing with what he wants to get done. So we sort of have this like clash of characters. Neither of those two characters are particularly likable, although they do have their moments where you sort of start to understand what motivates them and so on. But they're not particularly likable sort of characters. And the way that they sort of interact and behave. It's a very sort of, insightful sort of depiction of the influence of these, colonial nations and the way that they interact with other places and people who are just trying to live their lives. So those two men are not particularly likable, and we spend a lot of time in their heads. The characters that live on the island, so we've got the Irish, obviously Irish people. We have a family who has been marked by tragedy in a way, well, definitely has been marked by tragedy, because prior to the events of this book, so we have 4 generations, and basically all of the men, husband, father, grandfather, all died in a fishing boat accident, all at the same time, and they've all drowned. So obviously that has had a sort of lasting impact on everybody on the island, and we're left with Mairead, who is the mother. We've also got James, her son, and we've got Banny Lynn, who is her grandmother, and Banny something else, who is the mother. So 4 generations. The son, the mother, grandmother, great-grandmother. Banny Lynn being the great-grandmother. And yeah, they are really interesting characters, and I really like spending time with those characters. And yeah, so that was probably the standout of the book, was this family of characters. But I will say there were some things that made it hard for me to enjoy this book. I've already talked about the characters not being particularly likable, though I sort of could see the point of them not being likable. So that wasn't in and of itself, a complete difficulty, except that was paired with an odd writing style. So it was sort of a very experimental style where there's no speech punctuation. So I was very grateful to be listening to the audiobook while looking at the book, because I would have found it pretty difficult going without that, if I hadn't had the audiobook in my ear to kind of match the text that I was reading. So that was tricky. I didn't love that departure from standard punctuation, but also standard sentence structure I didn't like the departure from, because it made it hard to kind of follow what was going on. So it was a little bit experimental in that way. I also didn't like the way that the book ended, and I won't spoil it for anybody by telling you what it was, but I will just say it was not a satisfying ending for me. And I don't necessarily need everything to be tied up in a neat little bow, but like it just sort of felt abrupt, and it felt like it had been going one direction and then it sort of pivoted at the end and was a bit too open-ended for me. So yeah, I was not a massive fan of those things. So for that reason, I gave this 3 stars. It wasn't my favorite, but I am glad that I have now read it and it's now done from my TBR. Okay, moving on to a book I don't have a copy of, and that is because I read it on Everand on my iPad, which I'm going to begin by saying is probably my least favorite way to read a book. I don't like reading a physical book on Everand. I mostly use Everand just for audiobooks, but this was like an ebook, and I was reading it on my iPad. So it was a read that's going to factor in a little bit into my review. So the book was The Railway by Hamid Ismailov, translated by Robert Chandler. This is a book that came out originally in 1997, but was translated into English in 2006. So it has been out for some time. The reason that I read this book is because it was from my Read Around the World book club. So this was a book for Uzbekistan, I want to say. I think I'll put it up on the screen if it's not Uzbekistan. But yeah, anyway. Now, what I will say is there were some really good elements to this book. Essentially, so it's called The Railway. All of the kind of characters and stories in this book are, I'm going to say, tangentially related to the railway being there. The events could not have happened without the railway being there. But I would have thought, given that it was called the railway, that there would have been a more railway focus. Like that more of the stories would have taken place on trains or while they were building the railway. Some of them did, but most of them didn't. And we sort of have this town that was along the sort of ancient Silk Road, the Silk Route. You know what I'm talking about. So a town that was relatively isolated prior to the coming of the railway. So that's what I mean by the railway being there was sort of part of the reason that any of these stories could take place. But it was much kind of more tangential than present in most of the stories. So essentially we have this small, relatively isolated town in the middle of nowhere that is only really connected to the rest of the world via this rail link. And yeah, it was a bit confusing. It took me a little while to kind of get my head around the kind of the way that this book worked and who the different characters were. There was a really big character list at the beginning of the book. But again, because this was on the iPad, I find ebooks can be a bit tricky when you need to be kind of back and forth. If you've got the physical book, it's easy to just sort of keep your finger in the bit and kind of flick back and be like, oh yeah, that's right. Or you can kind of quite easily, I find, flick back and forth when you need to refer to a list like that. But obviously in the ebook format, it's a bit trickier to do that. Especially in Everand, where you try to do that and then it gets a bit muddled when it tries to come back to the place where you were. Anyway, it gets a bit tricky. You can use bookmarking and so on, but yeah, anyway, it's just an extra layer of fuss that I don't appreciate. I don't need in my reading. So it was a factor in me not enjoying this book as much as I perhaps might have. So what I will say though, the cast of characters is huge. There are a lot of characters, and it took me, I'm going to say, into about a quarter of the book. Mind you, this is a book that's 366 pages, so it's not super long, but it's long enough. So it took me about a quarter of the book before I realised that any of the characters were connected in any way. And like, just that's how kind of confusing it was. So I don't think I really followed this cast of characters so much, although as the book went on, I'd be like, oh, this is the guy that did the thing. You know, so I was making connections later on in the book, but just the names of the characters wasn't enough to kind of jog my memory as to who they were and what they'd done. Yes, it is Uzbekistan. I'm just not finding the word in my notes. It definitely is Uzbekistan. The other thing that I didn't love about this was there was a fair amount of violence in it, and some of that violence was sexual violence, which I am never really a fan of. I mean, obviously, I'm not a fan of it in general, but reading about it in a book, you know, I don't mind it being there if it sort of feels like it serves the plot, and isn't too kind of gratuitous or like over the top, but this did feel gratuitous. It did feel like some of it was really unnecessary. Like there was it was never referred to again. It was just like, here's a awful thing that happened, and it's super violent and yeah, just horrible. The end. No, we're not talking about that character ever again. So yeah, it just was a bit like that. One thing I did like about the book was the translator's note that was at the beginning of the book, because the translator was super passionate about the project of translating this book into English. And there were some quite like poetic moments in the book. So, you know, it's not that this guy can't write. He definitely can write, and the translator did a great job of translating it as best he could. But it was just a lot, and it wasn't really my thing. So I ended up giving this 2 stars, which I don't often give ratings below 3 stars. I mean, if the book does what it says on the tin, I generally will give it at least a 3. But like, yeah, this just was... It's 2 rather than 1 because there was some good language in it sometimes. There were some poetic moments. So yeah, not my favourite book that I read in February. Yeah, so it was not really for me. Let's move on, shall we? I think we've had enough of the railway. Okay, let's move on now to my next book, which I do have a physical copy of, and it's this one, The Grandest Bookshop in the World by Amelia Mellor. Massive tone change from the previous book, because this is a middle grade fiction, Australian author. It's set in Melbourne in a sort of different past, an imagined past, I guess. And it has some sort of elements of magical realism that I will say were never entirely explained, as to why they were those elements. There's magic in this book, and it's sort of not really explained. It's just there, but not in a way that sort of felt right. The world is too close to our world, but with a bit of magic. So it was just a bit confusing in that way. Anyway, let me tell you a little bit about this. So we've got Pearl is the main character. Her brother is called Valley, which is short for Valentine. I think Valentine. Anyway, I think it was Valentine. Anyway, these 2 siblings live with their family. They have some older and younger siblings as well, but these 2 are sort of like the focus of this book. They live with their family in Cole's Book Arcade. So their father is Mr. Cole, who founded the arcade, and essentially this is a kind of magical kind of it is a bookshop, but it's less about the books and more about the attractions. So there's sort of like scientific stuff, there's like museum-y type of stuff, like you know, natural history stuff, but also like living animals, and some sort of like, you know, interesting things, some of which are kind of there because of magic, and some of which are kind of contained because of magic. So there is sort of this magical element that kind of goes through it that, again, is not super well explained. We then have this guy who calls himself the Obscurosmith, and he has done a deal with Dad that has gone awry, and the kids sort of have to save the day, essentially. So to kind of, and they kind of engage in this game with the Obscurosmith as another deal to win their lives back, basically, and the arcade. So this was an interesting book. It had good pacing. The characters were quite sweet and not overwritten, so that, you know, it was readable. As I said, there was this element of magical realism that wasn't really explained, which I didn't love. I would say this book is most suited for kind of older primary, so, you know, year 5 and 6, I would say, and maybe a little bit above that. I gave this 3.75 stars, and not quite a 4-star read, but it was enjoyable. I think if the magic system had been kind of more fully fleshed out, I would have liked it more. So this could have been a bit longer. As it was 291 pages, so I definitely could have done with a little bit more, and I think it would have worked a tiny bit better. But I did enjoy this. So yeah, 3.75 stars. Okay, second last book that I read was actually a tiny one, and it was Binti by Nnedi Okorafor. I listened to this one on audiobook, and the audiobook narrator was Robin Miles. This is a sci-fi book, and it is, I would say, probably YA. If it's not YA, it definitely had a YA feel to it, and there were some elements of the story that sort of felt quite YA. So our main character is Binti, the titular character from the book, and she is the first Himba, and that is the name of her people, to be offered a place at Umza University, which is in space. So this is, as I said, it's a sci-fi book, so it's set in space. So she accepts this position against her family's wishes, and then she leaves on a space shuttle. And then as the space shuttle is heading towards the university, she's on board with all the other new students who are accepting their positions to this university as well, along with some staff from the university. Something happens in the space journey. It was 18 days in, and she then is isolated. I don't want to say too much because I don't want to spoil it for anybody who wants to read it. It's really short. So the audiobook was 2.5 hours. It wasn't a long one at all. So it's essentially like a novella at best, maybe even a short story. Anyway, so something happens. She's isolated. She kind of has to save the day. So this was an interesting book. It felt, as I said, a little bit YA in parts, just in the kind of character explorations, I guess, for the most part, and like the fact that they were kind of young people going to university. Yeah, I also felt like some sections could have been more fleshed out and others could have been reduced. So there was some, like, and this was, I guess, the bits where it felt a lot more YA, was like the kind of oh my feelings kind of parts, and I felt like those went on for a bit too long for the length of the book, and some of the other plot points and like aspects of the book could have definitely been expanded to make them make a little bit more sense, and I guess also resolve some issues that came up within the book. It felt like there was not an adequate, I'm trying to say this in a way that's not going to give away what happened. So the event that happens 18 days into the journey on the space shuttle, it didn't feel like the fallout from that event, when everything was being resolved at the end, was an appropriate way for it to be dealt with. I'll leave that open to your interpretation, but it just sort of didn't, in that way I was just kind of left at the end of the book going, what? Why has this not been adequately addressed in the way that things have resolved? That was a bit weird for me. So for that reason, mostly, and also because of the sort of issues with, you know, bits that needed a bit more expansion and bits that needed to be maybe edited down a little bit, I ended up giving this 3 stars. So it was fine. I enjoyed it. It definitely had like pace to it and was kind of, I wanted to know how everything resolved, but I also felt like that could have been done a bit better. Okay, let's move on to the last book. Okay, and that is Year of the Rabbit by Tian Veasna. I hope I'm saying that correctly. Now, this was also translated by Helga Dasha, and it was published in 2019. So this is a memoir. It's a graphic novel memoir. I actually started this book back in August last year, and again, initially I had been reading it on my iPad on Everand, which is even worse doing a graphic novel in that format than reading a book, an ebook in that format for me. Which is why I ended up putting it down. I'd read a good way into it back then, and then I abandoned it because I didn't meet the deadline. I was reading this again for my Reading Around the World book challenge. This was our book for Cambodia, and I didn't finish it before everybody else finished it and we were having a chat about it. So I then was like, I'll get back to this at some point, and then I just didn't. Eventually, at the beginning of this year, I looked it up to see if there was a copy in one of my libraries that I go to, and there was. So I went and got it, and here it is. And with this copy of the book, I read it in like 2 days from start to finish, because I went back to the beginning because it had been such a long time. I was like, I need to go back and kind of remind myself what was going on. And the bit that I had read that had taken me ages to read on the digital format took me like less than like a couple of hours to read up to where I had been up to, and then I continued on. So yeah, like this was much more engaging in the physical format. So I will suggest, if you are going to be selecting whether or not whether you read this digitally or physically, I would very much recommend the physical book. Anyway, this is a graphic novel memoir, as I said, and it examines the events that happened under the Khmer Rouge. This is a story of like one family and what happened to them. They ended up being stuck in Cambodia for some time before they were able to get out. And not everybody makes it to the end, spoiler alert. Not everybody made it, but some of them did. So there is hope in this book. It's not all doom and gloom, but it certainly is a challenging read in terms of what happens, which you would imagine, given the time and place in which it is set, because we know some really horrible things happened under the Khmer Rouge. So this book is based on first-hand accounts. So this is the son who was born like 3 days into the reign of the Khmer Rouge, and he has interviewed family members to talk about what happened, and he's then turned it into this graphic novel. I believe he now lives in France. So yeah. Anyway, so we've got things like, you know, the confusion that happens as people are like a bit unsure as to what direction things are going to go and what's going to happen to them, and you know, people are evacuated out of places with this kind of idea that, oh, it's just because the foreigners are coming in and they're going to bomb the place, but actually it was because they wanted to get everybody out, so they could then take over. And then also, you know, you've got life on work camps, the sort of ongoing issues with like nutrition and ever-present hunger, like always being hungry, betrayal by their own people, and this constant fear of death. So it was very moving in that way. One thing I will say is that the art style is not really to my taste. It's not my favorite kind of art. It wasn't dreadful, but it wasn't to my taste. However, I will say the color palette is spot on, I felt, for sort of implying the past, but also kind of like for the tone of the book. I think they did a really good job of choosing the color tone in this book, which is a weird thing to say, I guess. But that was a thought that I had and a feeling I had about it. If I wanted to think about, thinking positively about the art, even though the style of the art wasn't to my taste, I definitely think they did a good job of choosing the colour palette. This book conveys life, I think, very clearly and accurately as to how things would have been for, like, normal people who were living under the Khmer Rouge. And one of the other things I also really appreciated about this book is that because, obviously atrocities happened, war crimes happened, crimes against humanity happened under the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, but none of that is depicted in a gratuitous way. So things that are horrific that happen in this book, because they do happen, are usually depicted like in shadow or at a distance or off camera, off screen, so you know that it's happened, but you don't have to see it. And I appreciated that because this could have been very confronting, like a more confronting book to read otherwise. I gave this 3 stars. I think it's a good way to kind of learn about what happened and what life was like for people in that time. But yeah, as I say, there were some elements in this book that weren't for me. So yeah, I think it's definitely a good way to kind of familiarise yourself with what happened for the regular people under the Khmer Rouge. But obviously there will be other books that look into this in different detail or more detail, or, look at things from different perspectives. So this is a good way in, I would say. Okay, so those are my books, my 6 books for the month of February. I didn't love the books that I read. There were a few that I liked more than others. No 5 stars this month, but that's okay because we can't have 5-star months every month, although that would be lovely. But definitely some really good books in amongst those. And books that I was glad to get off my TBR. So ones that have been hanging over my head for a long time or had been sitting on my shelves and I'd been meaning to read. So even though I didn't enjoy them as much as I would have hoped, I'm really glad that I finally got them and got them off my TBR so that I can move on to other books. I've also completely failed to acknowledge the fact that there is a cat behind me. This is Charlie, for anyone who hasn't seen her before, my other cat. Because usually I've got Xanthi, who my brown cat, who will appear in my videos from time to time, but the last 2 cat appearances have both been Charlie, so there you go. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this video. Charlie has been having a lovely snooze behind me this entire time, which I hope has added an element of relaxation to this video for you. Let me know down below if you've engaged with any of the books that I talked about. I'd love to hear your thoughts, especially if you have different ideas than I did about the books, whether you really disliked them when I liked them or vice versa. Would love to hear all about that down in the comments below. Also, if you have not yet subscribed to my channel and you would like to have some more bookish content from me, please hit the subscribe button down below as well. And yeah, I'd love to have you on board, so please feel free to do that if you'd like to make sure that you can turn up here a little bit more regularly. Alright, thanks so much for watching, guys, and I will catch you on the next one. Bye!